I've been sitting on this story for a while now. It happened back when I was in high school. I'm in my 30s now for context. Also, I'm going to refrain from using my real name and all my friends' real names in the story. You can look up the place I'm about to describe online, and I don't know if we'd still get in trouble, so it's best to avoid real names just in case. In my hometown, there used to be an abandoned military base. From what I saw online, it was used primarily during the Cold War and World War II. At one point, over 200 military families were housed there. It looked like a small community. I'm sure military bases all across the country have these small communities, but it still seemed weird to me. The village was abandoned in 1984. It was just left that way until 2014, and it was finally torn down. I remember growing up as a kid, we would always hear ghost stories about the abandoned village. I had heard every type of story you can imagine. Everything from demonic cults gathering there, to top-secret military experiments being performed deep underground. Anybody who lives in this area knows all about the abandoned village. It was almost like a lost piece of local lore. When I was in middle school, I remember my older brother coming into my room one night when I had my friends over, and he told me that they had been to the village. We didn't believe him. He described in detail what he saw. He looked genuinely scared, but I'm sure that was just part of him messing with us. He started telling us about the church and how the church had a secret door on the floor next to the altar. He told us that he could hear moans and screams coming from the church basement. After laying it on thick for a while, he finally had all of us believing him. His irrational story just added to the already mysterious lore of the abandoned village. For years, my friends and I would share stories about this place. We always said that once we were old enough to drive, we would investigate it ourselves. All through high school, we talked about exploring the village, but never went through with it. That was for two main reasons. One, we didn't really know the exact location of the village. We knew the area, but that wasn't enough to go on. We knew it was near the airport, but there's a lot of area around the airport that has no trespassing signs. And two, even though it was abandoned, it was still technically a military base. We had no idea what kind of trouble we'd be in if we got caught. And one cool spring night in our senior year of high school, one of my friends, Alex, came to us and told us that he knew where the entrance to the village was. We didn't believe him. He told us that someone he knew had been there and shared the location with him. I was so confident that he was making it up that I told him we should go and investigate. I assumed that we would never find the entrance, so that night around 11 p.m., we made the 15-minute drive to the approximate area. Alex didn't seem confident of the location. He kept telling me to pull over. Every 2 feet he'd say, "I think this is it," but it would just turn out to be nothing. Finally, we found an overgrown road. Alex claimed that this must be the path. There was a beat-up, old no trespassing sign covered by a bunch of trees. Since we had my car, I started to get nervous about going any further. Alex and my friend Nick were 100% down to keep driving forward. Getting in trouble wasn't even on their minds. They kept going back to the same argument. We'd been talking about it basically our whole lives, so let's finally do it. They eventually talked me into it. I started to slowly drive down the dirt road. I turned the lights off on my car and basically just let the car roll down the dirt path. We eventually came to one of those roadblock gates that go up and down. Obviously there was nobody at the security checkpoint, so I had to get out of the car and manually lift the gate. This is where it started to get weird. The next minute or so of driving, we could see a bunch of furniture littered on the side of the road. Beds, dressers, tables, basically anything you could think of. Then we got to another roadblock gate. This time I had Alex get out and lift the gate. After that final checkpoint, we were in the village. It was a surreal feeling. After all the years of hearing about this place, we were finally there. It looked like being in the Upside Down from Stranger Things. It was like a small neighborhood, but it just looked wrong. You could see that it was decaying. I pulled the car in front of the church. We all got out and quietly started to explore the area. The first thing I noticed was that there were no cameras anywhere that I could see. That made me feel a little better that maybe we wouldn't get caught. We went to the church first, and it was creepy. There was graffiti everywhere. I looked for the door my brother mentioned when I was a kid, and it was no surprise that there was no trapdoor. After exploring the church, we went and looked at some of the houses. It was so creepy. It was legitimate housing. It just looked completely abandoned. Some of the housing units looked like they'd been hit by a hurricane, while others were still intact. The housing that was intact was more creepy than the messed up units. Our friend Scott was with us, and the entire time he was freaking out. He kept claiming that someone was there. Scott was always afraid of something. We kept telling him that it was just because of the nature of what we were doing, that his imagination was probably playing tricks on him. While in one of the houses, we all stopped abruptly because there was an unnatural sound. What I mean is that it didn't sound like a typical noise a house makes. I asked my friends if they had heard it, and they all had. It sounded like wood creaking, like the sound it would make if someone were walking on the wood. Instead of continuing to listen, Alex shouted asking if anyone was there, and the noise stopped. We all stood in that house for a minute trying to talk about what we had just heard. I truly didn't know. Alex and Nick were sure that it was just an old abandoned house making noises, not Scott. He was sure that we weren't alone. Either way, I told the group I wanted to leave. I had such an uneasy feeling being there, and I just wanted to go home. I could tell Alex and Nick wanted to stay. Since I drove, I told them that we were leaving. While we were heading to the front door, Scott jumped back suddenly. He quietly pointed to one of the windows on the side of the house. 3 shadows can be seen moving on the outside of the house that was next door. We all became dead silent. Those were clearly the shadows of heads that were moving just outside the window. As quietly as I could, I stepped over to the window and looked outside. I could see the shadows move just out of sight into the backyard of the house we were inside. I whispered as quietly as I could that we needed to make a run for the car. Everyone nodded. Without thinking, we all just sprinted right out the door and in the direction of my car. Once the car was in sight, Scott, who was in front of us, screamed at the top of his lungs. We all looked, and standing next to the back seat of my car was a tall woman with a disgusting old black dress on. She had the back door open, and it looked like she was about to get into the vehicle because one leg was already halfway into the back seat. When she heard Scott scream, she let go of the door and ran inside the church. We continued running towards the car. When we got there, I looked in the back seat, and thankfully, nobody was back there. We got into the car and drove off as fast as we could. I remember going so fast that I lost control on the dirt and almost crashed the car. That night, we shared stories about who we think we encountered. The most obvious answer is that those people were likely homeless in some capacity and using this abandoned facility as a shelter. All of that makes sense, except for why that woman would be trying to get inside my vehicle. It's also terrifying when I think about that night because we walked around for quite a while and never saw anybody, or even a clue that somebody had been there. Not until right before we left. Even though Scott claimed that he heard something weird, I still think that was just his imagination at that time. Years later, I started telling my girlfriend the story. She said we should look it up and see if it's still there. That's when I realized that it had been torn down in 2014. It's wild that there's so much more information on it now. Growing up, we constantly tried looking stuff up about that place, and there was nothing. Because of that, it added more to the mysterious lore of the abandoned village. I'm just happy we left when we did, and that Scott screamed when he saw the tall woman. If we had been 10 seconds later running to the car, who knows how this night could have ended. When my wife and I first started dating, we were reckless. Not in a way that harmed anyone directly, but We did some things that I would never do now. Things of questionable legality, in other words. For example, we would explore abandoned buildings and houses trying to find proof of ghosts. I never bought into any of that stuff. That was more of her deal, and I just went along with it because I liked the girl. Out of all the houses and buildings we explored, only one time was I left at a loss for words. I couldn't explain then what I saw, and I don't think I can explain now what I saw either. It was an extremely dark night outside, one of those cloudy nights that just makes everything feel so much darker. She had found this house that was not near anything. It was an old house that barely looked like it was standing. I was always sketched out to go inside these houses, not because I was scared of ghosts. I was sketched out to go inside because I never knew if these houses were going to collapse when I was inside. This house was in particularly rough shape. I had to kick down the front door, which was boarded up. Inside the door was what I assumed used to be a living room, except it was missing half the floor. In the middle of this room was a giant hole where the floor used to be. We took our flashlights and looked down the hole, and you could see what was left of the basement. I kept telling her that we should probably leave because this place clearly isn't safe. She didn't care. She kept telling me just to wait a minute. That was always her go-to line whenever I wanted to leave. She was sneaking around the house watching for holes, and I just stayed by the front door. I told her I was staying there because I didn't trust the floor. She laughed and called me a coward. A few minutes went by, and my curiosity got the better of me. I made my way into the other room where she was. The room was a mess, junk stacked to the ceiling. She was going through all the stuff, trying to find remnants of the people who lived there. That was part of her routine. I wanted no part of that. She told me to check the upstairs. She must have known I didn't really want to do that because before I could even respond, she said that the sooner we searched the entire house, the sooner we can leave. Reluctantly, I made my way upstairs. At any moment, I was sure I was going to fall through the floor. There was a room directly to the right at the top of the stairs. I went in there first. It was an old bedroom with a bed still in there. It was kind of depressing. The bed was still made, and on the bottom of the bed was a folded-up bathrobe. It was like somebody just disappeared and left their home as is. I continued looking around the room, and there was just more junk everywhere. A lot of clothes, some old knickknacks that were falling apart, and furniture that looked like it might break if you touch it. There was this weird crawl space in the corner of the room. Sometimes we'd find treasure in these crawl spaces. I went inside, and it was weird. It was filled with a bunch of baby stuff, like unopened boxes of diapers and baby food. But the stuff was old, like really old, and covered in dust and cobwebs. Some of the baby food had clearly been gone through by rodents, not to mention it smelled horrible. Just as I was about to leave, I thought I could hear the sound of creaking. I used my flashlight to look around the entire crawl space. In the corner of the crawl space was another little opening. I couldn't believe I missed it a second ago. I crawled over and looked down the opening. It was a narrow path that looked like it went directly across the length of the house to the other bedroom. The creaking sound was clearly coming from down that way. I was a little too big to crawl down the narrow path, so I left the crawl space and started heading toward the other bedroom from the top of the stairs. The other bedroom was down the hall and to the left. As I got closer, I could still hear the creaking sound. It was getting louder the closer I got to the bedroom. My heart was racing, but not because I was scared. I was completely ready to be jumped by a horde of raccoons. When I was just a couple of feet away from the doorway, the sound was clear. I quietly walked through the doorway, and I almost fell over. A woman was sitting in a rocking chair, staring out the window. I didn't say anything at first. The back of the chair was facing me, so I could only see the top of her head and what looked like a long skirt on her legs. Slowly, she just rocked back and forth. I was trying to see the reflection of her face in the window, but it was just too dark to make out any details. I took one step toward the woman, and the floor creaked. Once she heard that noise, she instantly stopped rocking. I started to apologize and told this woman that we didn't know someone lived there. Before I could say anything else, she started to rock again, almost like she was completely unfazed that I was standing there. For some reason, instead of running, I took another step forward and asked if the woman was okay. As I took that step, she stopped rocking again, and she stood up slowly. When she was standing in front of the rocking chair, I heard her voice. She didn't say anything. Instead, she just made this noise. It was like a low hum. Then, out of nowhere, she quickly turned around to face me. It made me jump, and I turned around and ran. I wish I could describe what I saw, but it happened so fast that I didn't really see any details of her face. All I could tell was that she was old and her skin looked wrinkled. I ran downstairs screaming that we needed to leave. I tried telling my girlfriend that we weren't alone and that somebody still lived there. She just laughed. She was so confident that I was messing with her. I was pleading with her that we needed to leave, that someone was upstairs in the bedroom. Instead of listening to me, she wanted to see for herself. I begged her not to go upstairs, but she didn't listen. I was screaming at this point to please leave, and she just continued to ignore me. I followed her upstairs and watched her make her way to the bedroom at the end of the hall. When she got to the doorway, I heard her say, "Oh my God." I ran to the end of the hallway just in case, and as I got to the doorway, she just started to laugh. Inside the room was the rocking chair, but no woman. She asked if I was scared of the rocking chair and continued to laugh at me. I told her that there was a woman there just a minute ago, but she just kept laughing at me. She went into the room and looked all around. There was no old woman. I swore to her that I saw an old lady, but she just continued to laugh at me. She walked by me and left the room. As she walked away, she said we could leave. We were both walking towards the stairs, and then we both heard it. The creaking sound again. The sound of the rocking chair going back and forth. She looked at me and froze. There was no doubt about it. It was clearly the sound of the chair. She mouthed the words to me, "What is that?" as we both stood at the top of the stairs. She took a few steps toward the bedroom and could hear the woman humming. It was like she was humming a melody. She got to the doorway and saw with her own eyes the rocking chair with someone sitting on the chair and humming to herself. She didn't engage with her. She just turned and ran, and we both ran out the door after that. She started screaming once we got to the car. She kept asking what the hell we just saw, and I didn't say anything. I wanted to look back at the house as we drove off and look at the window to see if I could see anyone standing there, but I was too terrified. I truly have no idea what we encountered that night. Maybe I really did have a brush with something paranormal. I know how unlikely that is, but who knows? Maybe that kind of thing really does exist. I suppose it could have easily just been a very old woman who still lived inside a filthy and decomposing house, but I don't fully buy that. I mean, the door was boarded up, and there was a giant hole in the living room. Not exactly ideal living situations. Not long ago, I brought this story up to my wife and asked her if she remembered. She obviously did. We drove to the abandoned house, and it had been torn down. There was no house there. Not even any remnants of a house. I try to replay that night in my head all the time. I try to remember what I can about that woman's face. I tell myself that it was just an old woman, but something in my gut tells me that's not the case. When I was in middle school, my family and I moved to a new house. It was an awesome house to be a teenager in. It was bigger than our last house, and the neighborhood was filled with a lot of kids my age. Just about everything was great about this new place, except for our one neighbor. It was the classic mean old man. We would go outside and play two-hand touch football, and if we even got within a couple of feet of his front yard, he would go crazy. He'd start banging on the window and screaming from inside the house that we need to get off his property, even though we never actually went onto his front yard. As an adult, I understand the feeling of unwanted kids on your property. The difference in this situation is that we were good kids and respected his wishes. That didn't matter. As we'd walk outside, he would instantly start banging on the window and yelling at us to get away from his house. It was like he was watching for us all the time. It was brutal. This went on for about 6 months after moving into the new house. One day, we noticed that he had stopped banging on the window. We didn't hear him or see him. I remember joking that he must have died. Why else would he finally leave us alone? Another month or so later, my friend Joel stayed overnight. We woke up in the morning when it was still dark out. I don't recall the exact time. We heard a bunch of commotion coming from next door, and we could see siren lights shining through the window. We got up and looked out the window, and right at that moment, we saw 2 people bringing out a zipped-up body bag. We knew right away what we were looking at. I remember feeling a little messed up by this. I'd seen this thing a million times in movies, but never in real life. I'll never forget that feeling of guilt. We were joking about this guy dying, and he really did pass away. I couldn't stop thinking to myself that he must have died over a month ago, and they just now found him. I didn't know that for sure, but something in my gut told me that was the case. After the old man's death, the house remained empty. Well, not completely empty. I guess the correct answer would be abandoned. All the old man's stuff remained in the house, and the house just lay uninhabited for years. Apparently, the old man did have one son, but he lived in another state and didn't even bother to come back after his father passed away. It's actually sad when you think about it. Over the next few years, I would sometimes stare out my bedroom window and just look inside the abandoned house. His house was directly next door, and from my bedroom window, you could clearly see into the house. It was so creepy. Knowing that this guy died somewhere in there always gave me the chills. For the next few years, I would always joke around with my friends. I would tell them that the place was haunted. My friend Joel, the one who witnessed the body bag with me, was one of those guys who was always scared. Every time I had people over to the house, I would tell Joel that I had seen the old man's ghost. He would cover his ears and tell me to shut up. Everyone would always laugh. I enjoyed being a troll in high school, especially when I had an audience. One night, Joel had enough of the trolling. He dared me to go inside the abandoned house. I didn't love the idea of breaking into the place, and that's what I told him. Joel started to troll me now, calling me a coward and a few other choice words. I thought about it for a second, and I honestly didn't think it would be that big of a deal if I took a quick stroll through the old guy's house. It had literally been empty for a few years at this point. Nobody would even notice if I broke in. I made my way over to the house. I tried to walk inside, hoping that maybe the door was unlocked. Of course, it wasn't. I tried kicking the door down, but I weighed about 130 pounds at the time, so the door was not budging. Next to the front door was a small window. I tried to pry it open from the outside, but to my surprise, it wasn't locked. It slid open easily. I looked back one time just to make sure nobody was watching me enter the house through the window, and then I entered. The first thing I noticed when I entered the house was the smell. It literally smelled like death. I started to gag. I had to put the collar of my shirt over my nose. In addition to the smell, it was creepy in there. Everything was exactly how this old guy had left it. In the living room next to his recliner was a book with a bookmark still in the middle of the book. I made my way to the kitchen, and that's where the smell was the worst. If this guy had been dead for a while in the house, like I thought before, I was thinking that he probably died in the kitchen. He had a small table in there, with a sweater on one of the back of the kitchen chairs. In front of that chair was a coffee mug. The stove had dusty pots and pans on the burners. I checked to see if something was in them, but they were empty, except for a lot of dust. I left the kitchen and entered a narrow hallway. The first room to the left was the room I was able to see from my bedroom. I entered the room and looked out the window. All my friends were in the window waving at me. Joel looked shocked that I was still inside. While I was waving back at them, I heard a loud bang come from the other side of the house. It wasn't subtle either. It literally sounded like a person banging into the wall. I stood completely still. I was trying my best to focus my hearing, but there was no follow-up noise. I looked back at my friends, and they looked confused, almost like they didn't know why I was just standing there. I was creeped out now. Just the weirdness of this entire situation had me feeling off. Even though there was still more of the house to explore, I was all done. I quickly made my way to the door, unlocked it, and let myself out. When I got back inside my house, I told my friends about what I saw and how terrible the smell was. We talked about it for a little while, but ultimately, we moved on quickly after that. That night, after we all fell asleep, Joel woke me up. I asked what he wanted, and he told me he couldn't sleep because he kept hearing weird noises from next door. I dismissed him right away and told him to go back to bed. I tried telling him that his mind was playing tricks on him because of what I told him about the noise. He didn't say anything. In that quiet moment, I heard a weird noise. Joel perked up and told me that's the noise he kept hearing every few minutes. I admit, it was weird. It was like two loud knocks. I sprang up and looked out the window toward the old man's house. It was dark, and I could barely see anything. Joel looked terrified and asked what was standing in the doorway of the old man's room, the room I had been in earlier. It looked like a silhouette of a person. I dismissed it at first, telling Joel it had to be a coat rack or something. Then Joel became erratic. He screamed, "No way." He swore that he had just seen a silhouette move. His erratic behavior woke up my other friends. They all looked out the window and agreed with Joel. I told them that there was no way a person could be standing there. Obviously there was some type of shadow or something else that we just couldn't explain. While we were arguing among ourselves, Joel screamed again. This time he didn't say anything, he just pointed. I looked out the window, and now standing directly in front of the old man's window was a figure. Whatever it was, it had moved from the doorway to the window. It was still too dark to make out any details, but because of where he was standing, you could clearly see now that it was a silhouette of a person. We all started to freak out. We had no idea what we were looking at. While I was watching this figure, it started to move. I was able to see it walk back towards the doorway until it completely faded back into the darkness. I continued looking out the window for several more minutes, but nothing happened. I had no explanation for what happened. I remember telling my friends at the time that it must have been just the old guy's son finally coming back to the house. It was the only thing I could do to get my friends to somewhat calm down in that moment. We spent the rest of that night constantly looking out the window every few minutes, but we never saw anything again. It was about a year after that I finally met the old man's son. He showed up with a dumpster and gutted the entire house, then he sold it right after. My dad talked to the guy for a while, and he told my dad that he had a horrible relationship with his father. It took him years to finally get to the house and sell it. To this day, that is still the most terrifying thing that I've ever seen with my own eyes. I'm happy that I had several witnesses with me that night who all saw the same thing as me. I know sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, so it's validating to have other witnesses who saw the same exact thing. My friends and I still try to get together once a year, even though we all live in different states now. Every time we're together, this story comes up again. I have no idea what I saw in that old man's abandoned house that night. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for what we saw, and I just have no idea what it is.